you. Hi, what a pleasure to be here. I'm Jazz, I'm a podcaster and an author, which feels exciting to say because today is actually the release of my first book, which is at the back here, called Asylum Speakers. And it's 31 stories of migration and displacement, 31 people that have influenced me over the last 8 years. One of them is Gail, who you'll be hearing from later on this panel. And this work started for me 8 years ago when one person's story really impacted me. It was the story of my foster brother, Mez. Mez is from Eritrea. He joined my family in the summer of 2015. He was 12 years old, and he had fled compulsory military service, crossed the Sahara Desert, crossed the Mediterranean Sea, hid underneath the Eurotunnel train to make it to the UK, and he became my brother. And at that time, I knew very little about asylum or refugees or migration and the immigration system in the UK. And very quickly, through him, I learned a lot. And he became the first of 4 foster brothers that I now have from Eritrea, from Sudan, from Afghanistan, and from Libya. And over the last 8 years, they've impacted me, they've inspired me a lot to learn more about what's happening. And I set up an organization called Asylum Speakers, amplifying these important stories. They taught me how much a story can impact you. And today we're here to talk about climate change, right? Something that can feel so huge, especially as an individual. What can we do? How can we even really understand such a huge issue? And so I thought I'd do what I know best, the way that I can kind of understand a big topic, and read you a story. So I'd like to introduce you to Bobble. Now, Bobble is another story, not from this book. In the book, they're all real people, real stories. But Bobble is a fictional character, and he exists for the 10 million school-aged children in the UK to hopefully see themselves in Bobble as a hero and to make more compassionate choices in the future than our current leaders perhaps are. So I'm going to sit down. So get comfortable whilst I introduce you to Bobble, because for me, he really represents and gives a good insight and context into exactly why we're here having this conversation today. Bobble was a bibble who'd come from far away. Sailing in his boat, he'd been travelling for days. Bobble was sad. He felt empty and afraid. He'd had to leave his home, as it wasn't safe to stay. He imagined friendly places and dancing in the sun, praying that one day he'd get there, he'd be happy and have fun. The sea was very rough, with terrifying waves, but Bobble just kept going, so determined and so brave. Finally, he made it. As he washed up onto land, he lay there for a little while, just playing in the sand. When Bobble heard some music, he ran towards the trees, but sadly he wasn't ready for the welcome he'd receive. "Hello," he said, "I'm Bobble. I've travelled here alone. Can I live with you? I feel so lonely on my own." The others stopped their dancing, but they didn't say hello. They didn't want to welcome him. They wanted him to go. "There's no room for you here with us. You'll have to try elsewhere. Travel to the next island. Ask if there's space there." As Bobble walked away, tears filled his tired eyes. "I just want to belong somewhere. Why don't they realise?" He trudged back to the beach and got back into his boat. Then he made a little bed and snuggled down under his coat. As he curled into a ball underneath the glowing moon, he dreamt he'd find a new home one day very soon. But what Bobble didn't know, whilst fast asleep that night, was the others on the island were about to have a fright. The sky began to flash, the clouds began to rumble, the wind was howling through the cliffs, and rocks began to tumble. The storm wasn't stopping, the waves were getting higher. Lightning struck the island trees and set them all on fire. The others were terrified and sheltered in a cave. They needed help from someone who was strong and very brave. Help! Bobble didn't hesitate. He ran towards the danger. Even though they'd been unkind to him, he went to help the strangers. I'm used to this, he shouted. I can help you, just stay calm. Trust me and I promise you won't come to any harm. Bobble got to work. He knew exactly what to do. No storm was going to win against this tiny rescue crew. He dragged his little boat and launched it out to sea. Then he rowed towards the flooded cave and set the others free. Bobble gathered all his strength to paddle back to shore. The others hadn't ever seen such bravery before. The rain began to ease. The storm was moving on. The clouds had stopped crashing and the lightning had gone. Everyone sat silently, staring at the waves. The treehouse was ruined and nothing could be saved. Why did you help us when we sent you away? We were selfish and unkind when we said you couldn't stay. Bobble glanced at all of them, looking back at him. He had so much to say he didn't know where to begin. I had to leave my family and say goodbye to friends because the danger on my island didn't look like it would end. The world would be an awful place if we can't help each other. The most important thing is that we're kind to one another. The others all hugged Bobble and asked to start again. He was just amazing. They were proud to be his friends. The boat floated around, dancing on the softer waves, and they all knew that there was no choice. They'd have to leave that day. Bobble understood. He'd had to flee his home, and he wanted to know that they'd never be alone. Come on, he said. Let's go. I've done this once before. We'll all travel together and find a safer shore. We'll find another island and then build a new life there. I've still got some supplies left. There's enough for us to share. So in the morning light and in the warmth of the sun, Bobble's second journey had very quickly begun. But this time it was different, and as the story ends, remember as he leaves, he travels with his new friends. Sometimes people leave their homes because they have no choice. Make time to sit and talk to them. Listen to their voice. The memories they describe can be frightening and tragic, but deep within their courage is a special kind of magic. Thank you so much. I just want to let you know that we have a real-life Bobble here today, so I'm going to hand over to this panel and to the very important voices on it. So enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nothing like a children's story to kind of tug at your heartstrings. So what we're going to do today is have a conversation about refugees, about climate, about international law, about policy, and about some of the very difficult decisions and dilemmas that lie in front of us. So we have a really amazing panel. Gail Malaol is a South Sudanese speaker and advocate for refugees' rights. Michelle Yonatani is a senior policy officer at the Office of the Special Advisor for Climate Action, the UN Refugee Agency. Millie Thomas is a pro bono associate at DLA Piper, and we have been working with DLA on a whole range of different things. And they have a particular deep commitment to work and support refugees. One of the really remarkable things that the firm does. So I'm going to start with you, Gail, and ask you to tell a little bit about your story, because in some ways you embody both the courage and the personification and the dilemmas that we're all trying to face when we put a human face on this phenomenon. And so I'd like you to start by just telling our assembled audience a little bit about your story.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm really happy to see you all here. My name is Gail Malwal, and I'm a South Sudanese. I came to the UK 2 years ago, and I share my stories, and I advocate for the rights of refugees, and particularly South Sudanese refugees who have been displaced in their hometown by the conflict and war, and in which most of them were displaced too by climate change that happened in 2020. Before going any further, I would love to start it by telling you my story. It is a story of pain, betrayal, and pride. When I was 13, I left my country because of civil war. And I came to the UK, in which I arrived 2 years ago. It happened in 2018. I was living in a camp. I went to the camp in 2013, had a very young age, was just a relative without a parents or a sibling. When the war broke out in 15 December 2013 in South Sudan, it turned into an ethnic violence toward a specific ethnic group, which is the Nuer people. I'm Nuer by tribe in South Sudan. South Sudan has about 64 different tribes, and I happen to be one of them. When the war broke out, the government soldiers were ordered to target the ethnic tribes of the Nuer. They started killing them door to door, in which my father became a victim of that target. And after that, we had to escape our home and run into the UN compound in Juba to protect safety and refuge from the United Nations mission in South Sudan. On our going into the UN compound, we had to be stopped in several checkpoints. And my auntie, the one who took me with her children, had to shut us up not to speak a single word in a Nuer language because she knew how to speak Arabic, which is one of official dialect that we speak in South Sudan. And she had to deny the fact that we belongs to the Nuer for us to survive. And because she doesn't have any facial scarification that showed that she was a Nuer, and then we survived, and we had to go into the UN compound, in which I stayed there for a significant 5 years without a mother, a father, or a sibling. And then in 2018, I had to escape the camp with several friends of mine. The life was tough in the UN compound, and we are being threatened by the same government who live outside next door to us, shooting people several times, and at some cases climb some buildings near the camp with the snipers and shooting the refugee and the internally displaced people who lived inside. And then we decided to leave. I had to follow my friends because I play with them football and I go to school with them within the camp. When we left, we crossed the border and we arrived in Sudan, where unfortunately some adults took advantage of us and they sold us into slavery. I was sold into slavery, into modern day slavery 3 times, in which I happened to be in Libya and imprisoned for more than 5 months. And I had to be bailed out by someone who paid money as a bondage for me to go and work for him. And after that, he will set me free. So after that family bailed me out and paid for money to take me out of prison and work for them, I had to plan escape, and I escaped their home. And I ran into where some of other refugees stayed with the help of some South Sudanese brother. And after I left, then I had to meet one of a South Sudanese brother who happened to be from the same ethnic group as I am. And then I stayed with him, and he told me that we can go to Europe and cross the sea, go to Italy. And then we happened to take the boat with the smugglers. And then, unfortunately, we didn't make it. We were confiscated in the sea by smugglers, and we were taken to prison, in which we were held as bondage to pay money and free ourselves. So we stayed there for quite some time, beating us every day, and threatening us and killing some of the prisoners. It was a tough time, and one day we planned to escape and break the prison after some South Sudanese guys were brought into the same prison that we were in. And then we had to break the prison when the guard happened to come and bring food. It's like a pasta and water. We break the door, and then we attack them, and then we disarm them, and then some of them run away from the prison. And then I saw the keys fall down in front of me, and I took the keys, and I opened all the other doors with prisoners, and we break the prison, and all of us, we escaped. So, yeah, and after we escaped, all the migrants and the refugees in Libya that we helped break the prison were really happy, and they really praised us. And after that, they had to take us with them into their journey, and that happened for us to arrive in Italy. And then from Italy, I came to France, used to sleep under the bridges, and I came to Calais, I sleep in the bush, and until I got a chance to come to the UK. It was a tough journey, and what it makes me believe is that everything in life happens for a reason. And I believe that through resilience, patience, bravery, and confidence, one can make it in life through a storm. Thank you so much.
Can you tell us just your legal status in the UK right now is?
I've been granted leave to remain. Yeah.
Okay, so Michelle, we're going to draw back a little bit, and we're going to go from Bobble to a PowerPoint. And you're going to tell us a little bit about climate refugees and the framework and work that you've been working on at UNHCR. So,
thank you so much for this invitation to join this amazing conversation, to be here, especially here next to Gail. I mean, how can I follow you, Gail? You are, in every sense, the expert on this panel. So, I don't know if you could put the slides up. Is it me? Oh, I'm in charge. Gosh. Sorry about that. And I just... Put down now. Okay. Is it okay if I stand up and stand over there? So yes, I'm going to draw back a little bit and talk a bit about, more generally from a global perspective, and what we're talking about in relation to displacement, including refugees, and climate change. And the first point I was going to make is that people who are displaced are absolutely on what we call the front lines of climate change. What do we mean by that? We're all affected by climate change, but the fact is that certain countries, certain communities are disproportionately affected. It is not an equal phenomenon at all. In every country where there's inequality, inequity, human rights abuses, conflict, and so on, this all plays into what we're talking about. But, I mean, following you, Gail, I mean, I don't even need to make this point, that while we're talking about highly vulnerable communities, we're also talking about incredibly resilient communities, and I think you certainly are embodying that. On a global level, we're talking about around 70% of refugees under UNHCR's responsibilities or mandate, and about 80% of people who are internally displaced in their countries because of conflict and persecution are actually coming from highly climate vulnerable countries, highly climate vulnerable developing countries. And 40% of refugees are actually hosted not in countries like the UK, but also in highly climate vulnerable developing countries. It's worth remembering. We're working at UNHCR with some of the best cutting-edge scientists. This is a group called CGIAR. I can tell you some more about them, perhaps if anyone's interested later. But basically, this beautiful heat map is very much, there's a huge amount of climate modeling, enormous amounts of data behind it. But basically what it's meant to show you here today, the black dots you can see are UNHCR data on refugee and conflict-related IDP, stateless person locations around the world. And you can see basically that if you just think about some of the ways that climate is impacting people, in this case, heat, drought, and floods, that many of the areas where you see most of the displaced people located today are already highly exposed to those hazards. And this is the historical baseline, a relatively recent historical baseline. Look what oops, wrong way. Look what happens when we go in just to 2030. That's what we're looking at in terms of the escalation of the exposure to climate-related impacts. That's extreme weather events and also very slow onset, gradual environmental processes like sea level rise, desertification, biodiversity loss, and so on. Here again, we're only talking about heat, extreme heat, drought and floods, and how they're working together and creating risk. And that's I just came back not so long ago from the latest UN climate change conference, which was taking place in Bonn, in Germany. And that's where all the climate negotiators, you've probably all heard of the COP, right? So this is towards this year's COP, COP28, which is taking place in the United Arab Emirates. And this is where all the negotiators are basically refining their decision texts. They're negotiating their positions. And of course, you've got all of the really most climate vulnerable countries, civil society, community representatives advocating there loudly on the urgency of the situation. This is a climate crisis. It's happening now, not in the future. And we're all hugely frustrated at the pace of change, the pace of decision. It's far from commensurate with the challenges and the needs today, far from it. But we have to stay engaged in this. Why? Because this is a global challenge. It needs a multilateral global response, as well as the actions at local level. So I want to quickly share with you just one example of a flagship high visibility program that's been launched with lots of innovative ideas behind it by UNHCR, called the Refugee Environmental Protection Fund, because you'll hear in the climate debates, one of the huge topics right now is on the massive gap in financing that's needed to fund not only the mitigation of emissions as to try and slow down this global heating trajectory that we're on, but also funding even more so that's missing to help the most vulnerable countries and communities adapt to the changes that we already know are coming. At the same time, new on the agenda is something called loss and damage. If you all remember this, you'll be way ahead of other people at the next dinner party discussing all this climate change jargon. But basically what that's talking about is the impacts of climate change that we're already failing to avoid, right? So yes, we need to adapt, but it's already affecting many, many people around the world, especially the most vulnerable, including refugees and displaced populations. So some of these key challenges that this fund, this new innovative fund, is trying to respond to is that around over 2/3 of forcibly displaced people, as I was pointing out earlier, are from these most highly climate vulnerable countries. And the fact is, when people are forced to live in areas, often in already very marginal lands, and there's usually a reason why nobody's living there already, right, when they're given a place to live. So what's happening there is that they need the basics for survival, and they're using firewood mostly for their basic needs like cooking and heating, fuel. So about 20 to 25 million trees are being used each year by people in those situations, most of it for cooking fuel. And at the same time, they're facing huge number of different climate and social type challenges, including to do with their livelihoods, the safety of the habitat, the areas that they're living in, protection, peace and security. All of these things are colliding and come together. coming together. And indeed, there's a serious lack of sustainable funding to support really long-term, impactful programs. So UNHCR, a lot of our role is as a humanitarian actor. We're providing the life-saving Band-Aid, but it isn't a solution, right? So that need for that longer-term financing is really, really critical. And so with this REP fund, as it's called, basically it's an innovative, sustainable financing mechanism, really focusing on investment in reforestation in displacement areas, in highly climate vulnerable displacement areas, and in clean cooking programs. And the really interesting, innovative part of that is this is a first in terms of linking what's being done in terms of reforestation to the generation of what are called carbon credits. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that idea already, but this is the first ever refugee-generated carbon credit. So linking the outcomes from this programming into the global carbon market, and at the same time also creating green jobs for refugees, because what we're all looking for is not just to keep putting Band-Aids on their problems, but actually to support them to develop self-reliance, including those who are still in really vulnerable situations in conflict-affected and fragile contexts. So there's going to be some great first phase work done. There have been, for example, around sort of the legal and the financial administrative arrangements and so on. There's been an agreement with a bilateral development bank and different expert agencies coming in to implement this program, again, in its initial phase over the next 10 years, and to bring it to scale. And scale, by the way, is one of the huge challenges. There's lots of ad hoc things going on. There are plenty of solutions out there, but things are not being brought to scale and with the speed that's needed. So we're looking at environmental impact. So millions of hectares of green cover, basically, which will in itself sequester about 2.5 million tons of CO2 on average a year, and also lower the risk of landslides, which is a very real risk in many displacement contexts where refugees are living, landslides and flood risk and so on. Protection. It also, by this clean cooking, what it means, especially for women and girls, is an improvement in their health. Reduced exposure to cooking smoke, inhalation, a reduced risk also of gender-based violence for women, which is unfortunately a really common story we hear from many, many different contexts. Women whose responsibility is to cook, to collect the firewood, often like unprotected at night, and basically getting raped or attacked en route. That's what we're talking about. So this reduces that. The social impact includes that, you know, when you do this kind of climate action, as we call it, has so many different co-benefits, right? For development, for peace. So in these contexts as well, we're including not only the refugees, but working with the host communities. So it's helping to build that social cohesion and maintain peace between them, peaceful coexistence. And I mentioned again, the green jobs, so important. Helping people to be self-reliant, giving them, empowering them through access to those opportunities. I'll skip through this. And indeed, it's already attracting some partners who are really committed on this program already, including DLA Piper, which is great, including through some of the initial feasibility studies and the piloting in countries including South Sudan, in fact, Gail. And it has an initial capitalization target of 30 million US dollars in grants, which we hope will then unlock additional financing through carbon financing and concessional loans. To date, 3 million has been secured, so indeed we're looking for more support. And finally, just to mention to you that this year, I mean, this is one important flagship program and a real opportunity, high visibility. There's something called the Global Compact for Refugees. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but this year, basically, there's a huge mobilization effort happening around something called the Global Refugee Forum. It's bringing together heads of state, government, a whole range of actors, private sector, and so on, to pledge around what we can be doing to support refugees and hosting countries and hosting communities. And one of the big multi-stakeholder pledges just recently launched is on climate action and finance. So this Rep Fund would be part of the package, some of the flagship ideas that we're going to be bringing this year. And if any of you are interested in seeing how you might be able to contribute, please feel free to approach me or some of the colleagues here. Emma, and the other name? Tom, who's here somewhere in the room. Tom, there you are. Great, thanks. So back to you, Paul.
Thank you very, very, very much. An articulation of a solution to try and fuse the climate crisis with the refugee crisis, to keep refugees at home, to reforest, to generate carbon credits, and to create green jobs, all in one integrated package, something that we will return to. Before we come to the discussion, I wanted to now turn to you, and you are the resident lawyer. And I wanted to just turn to you and just give us a little bit of a framework of the applicable sets of laws that govern refugee protection in particular, but also how they may have to respond and adapt to the current realities and circumstances. Because I think one of the things that everybody feels in the world that we are in now is that the twin evils of accelerating climate change and widening inequality both within nations and between them are fueling, as you indicated, this unprecedented movement of people across borders. And as that moves, we either just have to accommodate that reality, fight that reality, or change our moral and legal frameworks. And you know, we're making choices by not making choices, but it would be useful for you to kind of give us some sense of a framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here and very honored to be sharing this panel with Gail and Michelle. As Paul mentioned, I am the resident lawyer on this evening's panel, and I'll try to keep this, you know, light and not too dry. As many of you may know, refugee protection is afforded under the Refugee Convention. The first section of that bit of legislation gives us a definition of who can be afforded this refugee protection. And in brief, it's people fleeing from harm and persecution, fleeing conflict and persecution. It does not extend to people who are moving because of climate change, solely because of climate change. There are, of course, a number of situations, and Gail will be far better at talking to this than I am, but a number of situations where negative impacts of climate change are force multipliers, threat multipliers, and it can underlie or foreshadow conflicts which then force people to move. And there are a number of situations, including those, where people will be afforded protection under the Refugee Convention. Alongside the Refugee Convention, there are also a number of international law protections that people can rely on. One of these is the principle of non-refoulement, which you may have heard about or read about before. It's the idea that you cannot be sent back to a country of origin where you are at serious risk of dying or threat to life. There's actually a relatively recent 2020 landmark case that I think it's really helpful to talk about and illustrates the way in which international legal frameworks are shifting, as Paul alluded to, shifting in order to accommodate this new and growing threat of people displaced as a result of climate change. That case is called Tasiota versus New Zealand. It concerns a Kiribati national who came to New Zealand and sought asylum on the basis that the place where he lived was uninhabitable, and he and everyone else who was living there could not continue to do so. New Zealand refused his asylum application, and an appeal was made by Tasiota to the UN Committee on Human Rights. That decision, whilst it did not find that Tasiota should be granted asylum in New Zealand, drew out some really interesting and important conclusions about how we assess this right to life. Previously, international jurisprudence has assessed the right to life on whether or not there is an immediate threat to life. However, in this case, the committee found that you can actually assess the right to life before there is an immediate threat. They called this the idea of a right to life with dignity. So they took into account adverse effects stemming from dangerous climate change and biodiversity loss, such as access to food, water security, and a number of other social, economic, and cultural matters that are taken into account when we assess the right to life with dignity. In this scenario, unfortunately, they found that there were a number of protections put in place in Kiribati, which meant that in this instance, it wasn't that they couldn't find that the right to life with dignity was being violated. However, this decision has been echoed in national courts, predominantly in a decision in Italy. It was echoed and a positive result was found. There are also a number of other relatively innovative human rights, rights under international human rights law that are also being employed. So in a decision in German national courts, the right against prohibition of torture and degrading or inhumane treatment was raised. And the German court found, again, in quite an activist in many ways decision, that there need not be a government perpetrator, or it need not be government-induced action which causes inhumane or degrading treatment. In fact, inhumane or degrading treatment doesn't need to have a perpetrator. And if you are sending someone back to a country of origin where they are exposed to circumstances which are inhumane or degrading, and those may be because of climate change, then that still represents a threat of violation of that Article 3. What I think is particularly interesting about these decisions, I obviously think there's lots of interesting things about these decisions, it's my job. But what's really interesting, and if you take away one thing from this spiel on human rights law, is that these decisions are not only happening at a national level, but they're taking place at an international level too. And you heard Michelle talk earlier about the need for multilateral, multi-scalar solutions. And that applies also when we look at using the law as a tool, and we look at the protection that the law can afford. So at the beginning, Paul asked you all, I'm not going to ask you to tell me what you think, asked you all whether people fleeing because of climate change should be afforded protection under the Refugee Convention. And that's an incredibly difficult question with lots of possible permutations of answers, but I think what's really important is whilst the international community grapples with that question, whilst we in this room grapple with that question, there are also other mechanisms, other protections under international law that are developing, and they're developing as we speak, in order to protect people who have to move as a result of climate change.
Awesome. And as a lawyer whose task was making things interesting, I think you succeeded. So
thank you very much.
Well done. It's not an oxymoron, an interesting lawyer, speaking as a lawyer. Okay, so I wanted to take one step back for a moment and just think a little bit about refugees, climate conflicts, and ask us to kind of zoom back when we think about this problem. So the Refugee Convention and the modern forms of refugee protection started and were premised on a world that is arguably paradigmatically different from the world we now live in and are going to live in. It was a stable world, and the idea was that it would be interrupted by spasms of conflict in which human beings would be treated in particular ways, subject to particular forms of persecution, and we should develop a body of protections that allow people who flee that to seek safety and refuge elsewhere. Now, if we believe that the world, and let's stipulate also that We've got to do as much as we can, as fast as we can to get to net zero by 2050, and every piece of that work has to be ongoing. But if we stipulate that, notwithstanding our best efforts, the world is going to change and is going to become a lot more, the destabilization is going to increase. Michelle's rather scary figures of 110 million people, 75 million in climate, moving from climate unstable places or in climate unstable places, is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think all of us believe that it's going to get worse unless it gets better. It seems that advocates have a kind of Rubicon we have to think about. We can either do what you do and live in your paradigm, which is, let's nibble at the edges. Let's fight cases at national courts. Let's take them up to the international level. And let's broadly expand protections to try and take into account the new reality, and do so in a way that admits that there is a devilish problem in the beginning, at the heart of this, is as we expand, what we may do is expand so much so that everybody can move across a border, because the protection that we want to afford people, the climate crisis will cause us to cause everybody to be eligible. But that's what lawyers do. Lawyers look at injustice, they advocate around it, and they try and expand protections, and the world be damned. Or we can adopt a paradigm which basically says, look, we're going to live in a world where people are going to move across borders for economic reasons and for climate reasons, and it's going to happen. And the paradigm we should be thinking of is not about, are you going to risk because it was a genocide, or because there was a civil war, or because it was climate, or because of economic inequality. We have to take a kind of Chicago school economic approach to this, which is X number of people are going to move across borders. The wealthy West can accommodate and should accommodate X amount of people moving across borders. It's actually in their interest. Refugees are resilient, hardworking, assets, incredible benefits to all of us. And what we should just be doing is having an agreement which disperses those people in a rational way across different places on an annual quota, and then just move as many people as the economics would dictate across borders, because actually there's a strong argument for it. And let's not trouble ourselves with these wacky and increasingly irrelevant distinctions from the perspective of refugees between who's at climate risk and who's at genocide risk. Let's just say people should move, and we're all... Now, there are risks in both approaches. But what I'd love is for you as a panel to reflect on, just at a high level, how we should be thinking about that, and then we can drop down into some of the details of what would follow from that. Michelle.
Thanks for that really easy question. I feel a little bit like a knife at a gunfight because I'm not a lawyer, but I have been working on these issues indeed. And so how would I look at it? Okay. What I have also worked on actually is data, trying to understand people on the move. And maybe one thing I've observed between people who data collection and lawyers is that you need definitions, right? Who are you counting? What are you measuring? What are you talking about? And yes, it's very often arbitrary, but somehow you need to draw lines around things for different reasons. Okay. So this I am familiar with. But at the end of the day, even if, whether it's for data or law or institutional mandates like UNHCR's vis-a-vis other parts of the UN system, or the role of public sector, private sector, everybody in this global challenge, I was having a little chat actually with Gail just before we started this event today, and reflecting on the fact that yes, at the community level, the community family gets up in the morning, they look at the problems around them and they don't go, today I'll just deal with food. Or today I will just deal with the cyclone, because actually there's a conflict going on. You have to look at things in an integrated way, and that's something that our programming, our law, in terms of not creating protection gaps, and so on. We need to have that integrated approach to looking at the problems and the solutions, and understanding it first, I would say, from the community perspective, from the perspective of people like you, Gail, and your family, from people who are actually experiencing these things on the ground. That doesn't answer the legal question, but at the end of the day, all those pieces need to fit back together, and that includes financing. and discussions in the policy arena which are talking about a mosaic of financing arrangements or funding arrangements and putting that mosaic together. Somebody was using in the Bonn conference one of the governments was using the metaphor of the mosaic and saying, right now we have a really ugly mosaic. It's not really fitting together too well, right? So putting all these things together in an integrated way is the big challenge in whichever field we're talking in.
So, Gail, your experience, as I heard it, stemmed initially from a civil war, conflict, ethnic persecution, and then you fell into modern slavery in a third country. Then you had to move across Europe. You had your own economic challenges, and along the way, you would have experienced and met other refugees who were moving for different reasons, but who were no less at risk. And so I guess to my question, do you think we should just expand the protections out, or do you think we should just be saying, let's start moving people who are facing these hardships in a more orderly way across borders without having to kind of prove the individual hardship, because a lot of people from a lot of countries are going to be able to assert hardship based on where the world is going to go. Where do you think, how do you think of it as a person who's lived it, and you know, this is not abstract for you?
Thank you. So I think it should be looked in a broader way because people have different reasons to leave their homes. And as Michelle stated, climate reason is one of the major reasons in which people leave their homes in countries. And the second is the conflict in the civil wars, and a lot of cases that happens to human beings in their daily lives. And I think it should be viewed in the general views, and all people should be treated equals, because when I was in Libya in prison, it is a different nationalities, and we had gone through the same situation in the prison. We all get beaten, we all get, mistreated, tortured, and everything. We all get it equally. So it depends on if your day has come or your day has not yet come to die. So that was the only difference. So that means if anyone has gone through that situation and make it to Italy or to United Kingdom today, shouldn't be denied to live here. He should be given the right to live here, because in the end of the day, we're all human beings. And I believe that the life that we live today as human, we live it through immigration or through migration, if I'm not mistaken. The world, people just move around because of conflicts, because of the past climate atrocities, and a lot of different things. So my belief is it should be all the same. Yeah, they shouldn't be treated differently.
Millie?
Well, how do I follow? I completely agree with you that the current frameworks that exist do not allow for all people to be treated equally. And that's why lawyers have to play this, imaginative game of coming up with how protections can be expanded. And that is not sufficient. And whilst strides have been made and will continue to be made, I don't doubt, that is not enough to provide a whole solution to a global and very real crisis. I think there are agreements that could be made at an international level that might expand or change what the definition of refugee is and change who can move. But I think when you talk about the kind of Chicago line of thought and quite a very different system to what we have, there are lots of barriers. I hate to be practical, but lots of very significant and some might say immovable barriers to being able to have that approach. And that doesn't mean that approach might not be a better solution, but I think we do have to think very practically, because as has been said multiple times, I'll say it again, this is a very real crisis that deserves very real solutions, and an element of that is kind of blue sky thinking, but a lot of it has to be stuff that works. So expanding legal protections that exist now is one way of doing that. But another way of doing that might be bilateral agreements between governments, international resettlement schemes that sit alongside existing frameworks for protection of refugees and humanitarian protections. And on top of that, there are all the multi-scalar financial solutions that we should be looking to, and which are really, really key in breaking the circle, in creating opportunities, real opportunities for adaptation to climate change as well as mitigation around the world, which mean that people may not have to move in quite such great numbers if we are able to actually pull our fingers out and do that work and mobilize that finance.
So if you want to kind of put the contrary argument to, being pragmatic from a rights perspective and then from an economic perspective, you could make the argument that actually keeping a rather narrow definition of refugee protection and seeking to confine that in a way that has a logic to it without a moral coherence. So you're going to say, I'm going to do this on persecution and civil war, and even though climate may lead to persecution and civil war, I'm going to look for that as my evidence and keep it to that. And then as the refugee movement, I'm going to turn to data scientists and economists and say, let's have a division of labor. Let's protect the rights in one area, and we call that refugee protection. And then let's move into the world of immigration policy and say we need a much more open and imaginative immigration policy. And instead of the Germans taking 1 million Syrians and 1 million Ukrainians, let's just have a very broad-minded approach to welcoming in economic migrants to deal with the demographic crisis that the West is experiencing, the skills gap, the dying of entrepreneurship. And then let's invite a load of people who may be suffering from the inequality or the consequences of climate change and deal with it there and have a kind of division of labor rather than seeking to conflate the areas. And then you can sort of sit in the middle, right? You can go, I'm going to take the REP fund, I'm going to get a bunch of impact investors to buy carbon credits, reforest, create green jobs to give people dignity at home. And then I'm going to encourage Italy and the UK and Norway and Sweden to take groups of people under an economic migrant category and keep the refugee area for conflict, even though I regard that as factually and morally somewhat suspect. It gives us a division of labor in the economic international law space. But it seems to me that as advocates, we've got to, and probably as advocates, we never agree. I mean, take a bunch of human rights and NGO people and lawyers in a room and try and produce a consensus and good luck. But we've got to have this debate in these terms and kind of pick our horses. So you sit within a beast that is a multilateral beast that's got a fantastic reputation for kind of mulling these over in a multilateral setting. Are these debates and discussions happening within the movement and within your offices?
Absolutely. It's a very live issue. UNHCR has issued a couple of years ago now what they call legal considerations, which talks about exactly how international refugee law can be applied to people who are being affected by the adverse effects of climate change. And I think I'd just like to make a couple quick points I think maybe were missed before. I mean, you can hear it here, but basically climate change never acts on its own. It's one of these mega mother of all risk multipliers, right? So it's affecting food, water, all those basic things that people need to live with dignity and to survive and thrive, right? So it's not something you can put on a box, first of all, on its own. It doesn't work. It falls down fast. There's something called attribution science, which is trying to bring more evidence to answer the question, okay, there was this storm, this extreme storm just hit London. Yeah, but was that climate change or was that just like normal weather variability? So what the attribution scientists are doing, and what some of the judges and lawyers are also quite interested in, is trying to say, okay, but if we didn't have climate change, global warming, what's the likelihood that we would have had a storm like that, at that intensity, right? And then they're able to say, okay, it was made 10%, 20% more probable to have that extreme type of storm or flood, etc. That's what they're doing. That's one thing that they're talking about. So just remember, yes, that is an issue, that attribution. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about with climate is something which underlies or overlies everything. It's really multiplying risk in so many different ways. You can't put it in a box. That's a problem for lawyers and data people who want to try and put it in boxes. Okay. The other point is actually even the 110 million figure I said, don't forget that the vast majority of them are actually internally displaced people. And that's a trend that we expect to continue, in fact, that most people who are being displaced from their homes, whether it's by a flood or by conflict and persecution, most of them are remaining within their countries of origin. It's actually a minority in that sense, a significant minority, 35 million refugees in the world today. But in the bigger picture of things, most people are actually staying within their countries. So it's the countries of origin, it's those countries who do not have resources to help their communities to adapt, right? That we're seriously falling down as an international community and not supporting them enough. So I just wanted to put that into the scheme of things, because it's often this climate refugee type discourse focuses on the people across borders. Absolutely, that's important. And from UNHCR. But we shouldn't forget as well, it's the people within countries that are often actually very, very marginalized even within their own homes. Most of your family, I understand, Gail, for example, are still back in South Sudan. And Sudan, as well as being highly fragile, is like being affected by massive floods, for example, right? So it's one thing on top of another, crisis upon a crisis. Conflict and disaster are not happening separately in these places. It's all a big mix.
So I want to come to your experience, having been granted leave to remain. We at the Conduit are in February going to have a major conference here, supported by the Open Society Foundation, on refugee settlement and integration in the West, and in particular asserting this thing that refugees are gifts to societies, that refugees are net enormous contributors, and that we're not doing enough to allow refugees to live up to their full potential and to give those gifts to the countries that they are hosted within. So can you tell us what your experience has been in the UK in terms of not the generosity of UK individual citizens, but government programs that have helped you land here, integrate, and achieve your potential? In what ways has the government helped you, and in what ways have the government hindered you in terms of settlement and integration?
It's quite a difficult question. That's why I laugh. Yeah. So I think it happens both ways. And the first way is, when I first came here, I was supported and by the local council, which is the government itself. And I went to college, in which improved my English more, yeah. And I can say I personally got the chance to be integrated into the society quickly, and in which I can say it, most of them is because I love to socialize with people and learn new things from them. And I made a lot of friends. This is on my side. And then on the other part, it is I don't think I have any. Yeah, there is no negative experience from the government. Yeah, so I think it's all the positive. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Millie, do you want to come back to just this question of whether we're better off or worse off by expanding the unintended consequence argument about imaginative lawyering, and be careful of what you succeed in your wildest litigation dream and what it may lead to, and you know, is that in fact a live fear and a worthy consideration?
What an impossible question. I think it's a very, very difficult question. Of course it is. We're all sat here today talking about it. And I think that there's a lot to be gained from pushing the envelope, from pushing definitions, from doing the legal masterminding. And when those decisions come back that are overwhelmingly positive and life-changing for people, then, you know, who am I to say that those decisions shouldn't be made and that envelope shouldn't be pushed? You mentioned unintended consequences, the unknown unknowns. I didn't bring my crystal ball here this evening, so I don't know what those unintended consequences would be. And I don't want to hypothesize about what they would be. But I think that what is really important, and it's a point that Michelle drew out, which is really fundamental here, is that climate change and the threat that it brings belies so many existing threats. And that is true of international conflict, or, you know, civil conflict, and the need to protect people who are fleeing those circumstances. But it's also true of a lot of other threats that we see around the world. So whilst pushing the envelope in this scenario and seeking to expand the definition of refugee under the convention, if that is something that we all want to do, then whilst that may be positive or may have unintended consequences, the same conversations are happening everywhere. We need all international institutions, organizations, all governments, local, national. We need regional agreements. We need every level of cooperation and consideration taking into account the very real threat of climate change and what that does for protections of people all over the world. Another thing that Michelle mentioned was adaptation. I think that's incredibly important. At the moment, adaptation finance accounts for 7% of all climate finance. It's tragically underserved. It's a really, really important part of being able to break this circle, of being able to get out of the, you know, lawyer academics of it all and actually create real change and to benefit people who are living in places where climate change is a really, really real threat, more so than, you know, we feel it here in the United Kingdom.
So we're going to turn over to the audience, but I'm going to do one quick shout out for your work on the REP Fund. And just to geek out for a second on the miracle of carbon credits for, you know, the conduit we can all take for granted that we all kind of can spend hours thinking about carbon credits and getting very excited. But it's worth for a moment just pulling back and say, we have created in recent times an entirely new category of commerce and finance. And that is something that you can buy which offsets the emission of carbon. And there is a big debate about them being phony and real and greenwashing. But let's stipulate that what you're doing, because I think you can stipulate this with confidence, is going to be real, because refugees who don't cut down trees and don't cut down trees because they're given clean cook stoves, then cause us, through the delivery of the clean cook stoves, not to, we avoid an additional set of carbon emissions through the deforestation impact that occurs when we cut down trees. And therefore, you have a way to finance this mechanism in a way that might be appealing to donors or to impact investors. So would you just talk through in plain English what that looks like? Because it's sort of a miraculous intervention on behalf of the climate and on behalf of justice that we as humanity have invented in modern times.
I can only do the top lines, I'm afraid. I'm also not a finance expert. But basically the idea in simple terms is you reduce risk to people in this very vulnerable situations while they are displaced by protecting the environment. By protecting the environment, you protect the people. And the way you protect the environment is you're planting trees, but it's a bit more complicated than planting trees. Enabling natural resource management to be far more sustainable in those settings, right? Which enables them to be far more resilient. That's the adaptation. The beauty of this is it's bringing together the adaptation and the mitigation, not because, quite frankly, it should be the main focus for these populations who have done the least and will be doing the least to contribute to climate change. Let's be clear on that, right? But at the same time, it is an opportunity which is being taken in a really innovative way here to use this new global carbon market indeed, to allow these communities, that's refugees with their hosts, to have credits that can then be pumped back into the fund. So the fund itself is not a charity handout, but it's actually something that in itself that becomes more sustainable over time, can provide that longer term impact, be taken to scale, all those things I was saying before which are hugely missing right now in the whole climate financing space.
Awesome. Okay, we have some time for questions. Please ask questions, don't make speeches. There's somebody in the back.
I will try to be as concise. Thank you so much. This was really fantastic. So I'm a scientist, but have studied human rights law, would not at all call myself a lawyer. But listening to a lot of what you were all saying about regulation in different experiences of different perspectives, as regulation and legislation exists today, it was built around one perspective, which is, so social science says, those drawn to law and regulation want to mitigate unknown, where those that innovate their comfort is the unknown. So I just would love to hear your thoughts on, do you think this approach of trying to mitigate unknown is best for our current and future challenges?
I'm going to take 2 or 3 and then we'll pass them up.
Hi, thanks for that. My question was around forgetting the label refugee. I'm part of an organization and we're doing something with payments that you're doing with carbon credits, rediverting the profits of banking to fund climate projects and training refugees into how to market that and getting an economic share in those banking profits. But it's that question both on a personal basis and on a structural basis for an economic program. How do we get to when we come to that point where you want these people to move on from the label refugee? They had lives before they were refugees and we want them to have normal lives again. But we're valorizing that difference for a while. Just your thoughts on that forgetting process would be great.
And then you had a question there.
Hi, thanks for an inspiring story and insights on the policy making. My question is, so you've spoken about some progress on national, international court cases and legal frameworks. And on the other side, particularly through the media, but also a number of G7 governments are pushing really, really hard against refugees. How are negotiations actually panning out in the policymaking space? Who's David and who's Goliath? And are we just seeing what's on the media and governments saying no, absolutely no more refugees? Or is there actually progress happening behind the scenes that is going towards what we've been talking about, and protection and so on?
Pick your favorite question.
I'll start with the last one. Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and there is this disconnect, right, between a number of incredibly powerful governments and the media in all of those places. And this is very, very damaging, dangerous anti-migration, anti-refugee rhetoric. I think what I would say is it will differ jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So I'm an English qualified lawyer. I wouldn't profess to know everything about all jurisdictions across the world. But you know, in the UK, we have quite a conservative, quite a deferential judicial approach often towards the lawmaking or policy-making power of government. That is not the same in every jurisdiction. So you see, like, in a number of places, whether it's relating to decisions on refugees or other human rights law issues, courts taking decisions that are really at odds or which are quite different to the policy that you can see in that jurisdiction. All that to say that it's really difficult to know because, like you said, there's such a strong flow of media which is not broadcasting any progression that is made in terms of expanding international law protections in this area. And often the way that, you know, I hear or people in these kind of circles hear about it is from people who work in that area, and they will talk about a case that they've worked on or heard of, but it's not broad in the same way that, you know, national media is. I think that a lot of the national policy in a number of powerful states is incredibly dangerous and incredibly harmful, and fails to take account of the action that is required in order to protect people and also to address the threats that we see today and we've spoken about today. Whilst I highlighted some quite positive movements forward in terms of international protection, it's not to say that there's not more work to be done, because there absolutely is.
Gail, I wonder if you wanted to respond to the question about the term of art refugee, whether it's you have found it empowering or disempowering, whether it's helped you achieve a degree of safety, but also perhaps put you in a bucket or defined you in a certain way. How do you feel about the term?
About the term refugee. I think the term refugee is like a name given to a person who seeks refuge, isn't it? I believe that if we level each other's names, it is quite, you know, it is difficult to really make a society or make the refugee themselves, people who flee to persecution, conflict, or climate change. So it makes them like, feels like they have a name in the society. In a state, we need to, so the system needs to be more inclusive. So I believe that they shouldn't be given a name, refugee. Like, it shouldn't be a level, but it should be something that happened to a person because of the reason why he left his home of origin. So what I mean by this here is, if you have been given a name and they called you with that name every day, and then it makes you feel that like you're not yet, you know, into the society. So it reminds you about all the things that you have went through. It reminds you about everything. And even if a child is born here, for example, or someone, give a birth to a child here, and he can hear about like you're a refugee, or the refugee background that his family or her, parents, the name that his parents has been given to as a refugee. So, it is quite disintegrating to such a people called refugee. Yeah.
Thank you. Pick your question.
Yes. The lady at the back, you were talking about acting, I'm not sure if I'm getting this right, how I heard it anyway, was something about acting on the basis of a lot of unknowns, potentially then... Right, okay. Climate change, as far as a global problem, challenge, is, I can't think, there's nothing bigger, is there? It affects everything. It affects everything. It affects all life on our planet. The planet will survive, but the survival of our species and every other species on the planet is under threat in different ways, right? So, but what we have actually is we have, anyone who's heard about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, reports, which basically are a massive peer review exercise of all the latest scientific evidence that's out there. Not opinions, science, right? And what they're showing us is far more than good enough these days in terms of how robust the evidence is of what we can already start projecting forwards as our serious risks. But the thing about risks is also that risks can be managed. So yes, there will be some things, absolutely, and quite devastating that we cannot avoid. We're reaching tipping points. That is, frankly, very frightening. At the same time, including in terms of what's happening to people who are being forced to leave their homes, whether they stay within their own countries or forced to flee across borders, what will happen, whether they first of all have the freedom to move, that's also another thing, right? But what happens to them will depend so much on actually what support they get, what we all do as an international community, if you like. What we do today will influence what will happen in the future. So the projections are out there, the science is extremely robust. Everything these days must be done on a no regrets basis. That's the principle that we're all working with. No regrets, right? Because the science is far, far more than good enough. And that means no business as usual, everybody. The big message from the Bonn conference was enough of the incremental change. We need transformative change, right? That's the scale of this crisis. That's the nature, the profound nature of this problem. I hope that helps to answer a little bit what you were saying.
With that, we are going to end, because Rosie has given me the shepherd's crook look, which is you're going to be hauled off the stage. But the good news is that the speakers are going to stay around. You are all going to stay around. Hopefully you can network, you can have a drink. And I want to just thank everybody, all four of you, for your really remarkable interventions. And thank you for a very thought-provoking and urgent and timely conversation. So thank you.